My name is Trina Medarev, and I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Jacksonville. And with us this morning are Jennifer Griffin and Greg Myre. Jennifer Griffin currently serves as the National Security Correspondent for Fox News Channel, which she joined in October 1999 as a Jerusalem-based correspondent. Prior to that, she reported for 3 years from Moscow for the network. Since 2007, she has reported daily from the Pentagon, where she questions senior military leaders, travels to war zones with the Joint Chiefs and Secretaries of Defense, and reports on all aspects of the military and the current wars against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Jennifer provided extensive coverage of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021. Jennifer provided, her experience in Afghanistan dates back to 1993. Reporting from Pakistan during that period, she covered the arrest of the first World Trade Center bomber, Ramzi Youssef, in Istanbul, and Pakistan's first nuclear test. She covered the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011 and conducted an exclusive interview with then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta in Baghdad on the days the Iraq War ended in December of 2011. Greg Myre is a national security correspondent for NPR and is also based in Washington, D.C. Greg's focus is on the intelligence community, following his many years as a foreign correspondent covering conflicts around the globe. Before joining NPR, Greg served as a foreign correspondent for 20 years with the New York Times and the Associated Press. He was first posted to South Africa in 1987, where he witnessed Nelson Mandela's release from prison and reported on the final years of apartheid. Greg was assigned to Pakistan in 1993 and often traveled to war-torn Afghanistan. He was one of the first reporters to interview members of an obscure new group calling itself the Taliban. He was in Moscow from 1996 to 1999, covering the early days of Russia's new leader, Vladimir Putin. We were delighted to host Jennifer and Greg recently for a dialogue with the World Affairs Council of Jacksonville, and is a special honor to welcome them here on behalf of the World Affairs Councils of America for a timely discussion on national security, how blind spots become global hotspots. And they're going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the mics and encourage each of you to come up and ask questions. And with that, please join me in welcoming Jennifer and Greg.
Well, thank you, Trina, and thank you for welcoming us here for this great conference. We've always enjoyed speaking to the World Affairs Council, most recently in Jacksonville. As Trina mentioned, I'm Jennifer Griffin. I'm the National Security Correspondent for Fox News. I've been at the Pentagon for the last 14 years, and my husband, Greg, is the National Security Correspondent for NPR, which means we have a lot of lively pillow talk and often have to say off the record before we go to bed. Greg and I met about 30 years ago in South Africa. Apartheid was crumbling. It was as Mandela was being released from prison. In fact, we were there that day in Cape Town when he was released from prison. And that, when we look back over our careers, was really one of the last positive news stories that we've covered for quite some time, and gave us a lot of hope at that time. But as we looked back at where we had lived and covered wars and conflicts over the years, we looked at Pakistan, where we'd lived, Afghanistan, Russia, the Israeli-Palestinian areas during the Intifada. It was really hard to see much progress that's been made since then. There's been a lot of changes, but we've also seen a lot of mistakes made by those governments as well as by our own government. In Jacksonville, we were asked to talk about national security hotspots and blind spots. But we realized when we look back over the places we had lived and the stories we had covered that it was really more relevant to talk about how blind spots become hotspots. One of our first assignments was in 1992 in Somalia, Mogadishu. I had just graduated from Harvard, and I had gone down. Greg and I had started dating after Mandela was released, and I had flown down to South Africa, and he had been sent on assignment to Mogadishu because there was a famine that had broken out. There were very few journalists there. This was back when there was no email, no cell phones. You couldn't communicate very easily. He had flown off to Mogadishu. There were no international flights into Mogadishu. So I took the money my father had given me for graduation and basically used it to fly to Kenya, where I was negotiating with the drug dealers there, the khat dealers, who were flying little Cessnas into Mogadishu, and you could pay your weight in khat to fly on these planes and to get into war-torn Mogadishu. And at that time, UNICEF was also flying in, and they felt sorry for this young 20-something journalist and flew me into Mogadishu. I surprised Greg, who was staying at the UN house, and we started reporting on Mogadishu. And fast forward some of those stories that we did that summer when there were very few journalists there, BBC, Reuters, and AP at the time, led to the U.S. military involvement in Somalia. And later that December, the Marines arrived. It started off as a very positive humanitarian mission, and then slowly the troops got dragged into what we knew eventually happened, Black Hawk Down, U.S. troops chasing after a warlord that they couldn't ever capture. Somalia descended into becoming a terror base, and many people don't realize that the U.S., even as of last December, still had troops in Somalia. It was still a failed state, and 30 years later, the U.S. military was still involved and is still involved in Somalia. Somalia really became a microcosm if we look back on the countries we covered during the last 20 years, and that takes us to Afghanistan in 1994 and our honeymoon in Kabul.
It's true. I did take Jennifer there for our honeymoon in 1994. It's a decision I'm still paying for. But the larger and more important point is Afghanistan in 1994 was truly a blind spot. The world had forgotten about Afghanistan after the war in the 1980s, where the Soviet forces were driven out by the Mujahideen. And just to paint a little picture of Kabul at that time, it had gone from a hot spot in the 80s to a real blind spot in the 90s. There were no embassies there, no flights going in and out of the country. There was no electricity, no running water. Restaurants, hotels were closed down. We lived in a house where the windows had all been shattered by rocket fire in the neighborhood. It just had plastic sheeting over it. You couldn't, when we would go from our base in Pakistan to Kabul, we couldn't communicate with our office for 2 weeks. You'd basically go, you'd collect the material, you'd have to go back and write. I'd get a call from somebody at the U.S. Embassy who wanted to know what I'd seen in Afghanistan because the embassy had long since been closed. So it's a real example of what happens, and it felt like the end of the world. And the Afghans would be pleading with us. We were so important. We helped defeat the Soviets in the Cold War, and now you've abandoned us. You've forgotten about us. And it's a real example of what happens when you develop one of these blind spots. We were there on our honeymoon and in the months that followed, mostly because the Taliban had just been formed in 1994 and were coming up the road from Kandahar in the south and reached the outskirts of Kabul, where they would hang out for a year or two before they took over. We treated them just like the other warlords we knew in Afghanistan. We drove out there, talked to them, asked them what their plans were, and they told us very explicitly, Sharia law, we're going to rule the country as the Quran tells us. And nobody was paying that much attention at the time. One other related development, Trina mentioned it in the introduction. In 1995, when we were in Islamabad, the Ramzi Yousef, the man who orchestrated the first World Trade Center bombing, was captured by the U.S. about a mile from our house in Islamabad. A little shopping area where we bought croissants every morning, where a little bakery was. And all those Pakistani guys who sit around all day in the sort of baseball catcher squat, smoking cigarettes, they're really, really good witnesses. So we went up and talked to some of them, found them, and we said, hey, have you seen a picture? Do you know this guy, Ramzi Youssef? And they said, yeah, sure. He stayed at that guest house, and he shopped in that market, and he went to that video store. We thought, video store, that sounds interesting. We walked over to the video store. We said, hey, have you seen this guy? Yeah, he comes here all the time. Can we see his video card? And they pulled his video card, and I promise you, the last video that Ramzi Youssef checked out before he was captured was Fugitives Among Us.
You can't make this up.
Yes. When they captured Ramzi Youssef and an accomplice who was actually in the Philippines at that time, on their computers, they had a plan to blow up multiple U.S. airliners over the Pacific at the same time. So here in 1995, and this is a story that we wrote and others wrote as well, you had the person, Ramzi Youssef, who'd orchestrated that first World Trade Center attack. You had his future plan, which was attack multiple airliners at the same time. And so it was all there. And so 6 years later, we, like everybody else, lacked the imagination to know what could happen 6 years later. But when the world 9/11 happened, it was orchestrated by Khalid Sheikh, for Al-Qaeda, by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the uncle of Ramzi Youssef. And so this, to us, just speaks to this notion of there's always breadcrumbs out there. There's always little hints, little details. And they're hard to pick up on. I didn't pick up on them, so I'm not blaming anybody else who couldn't pick up on them either. But it really is this example of how blind spots become hot spots. From Afghanistan going hot spot in the 80s, blind spot in the 90s, and then it comes back in 2001. On that note, I want to do a quick little thought experiment here. Imagine that it's the year 1961, 60 years ago from right now. The U.S. has just begun to send a very small number of advisors to a faraway place that doesn't seem all that important, South Vietnam, where they will help the South Vietnamese military. What if someone had predicted at that time that over the next 60 years, the U.S. will fight 2 major wars that will last collectively over 30 years, 30 of those 60 years. And the U.S. will devote enormous resources, manpower, technology, money to these wars, and will lose both of them to small countries, Vietnam and Afghanistan. Nobody would have believed that. But to us, as I thought about this, and we've been thinking about it since the end of since the Afghan pullout in August, it really spoke to a lot of the experiences that we had all these years going to troubled countries about how the blind spots become hot spots. That the U.S. can get drawn into a place that it doesn't know that well, create elaborate plans about remaking a country, and then find itself in a very extended conflict that ends in failure.
And that takes me back to Afghanistan. And what I remember in the 90s when we were there, we remember that there was no U.S. embassy in Kabul. And so one of the reasons I became a journalist is that the VOA correspondent was not allowed to travel to Kabul. And so I filled in for them, and I went up as a freelancer and would be able to come back and report to the embassy and others about what I was seeing. I remember members of the CIA who would come and visit diplomats in Islamabad and try and tell us that the Taliban aren't that bad, and that, in fact, we should really give them a chance. And then I remember also people coming up to us in Islamabad and trying to sell us Stinger missiles that had been left behind by the U.S. military. They never appeared, and we never received the Stingers, but it sounds awfully familiar to us leaving quickly after the Soviets pulled out, leaving a vacuum, leaving weapons behind, and thinking we can wash our hands of that region. This summer, in July, as the U.S. military was pulling out of Afghanistan and had closed Bagram Air Base, I had a conversation in the Pentagon there was a Boston Globe journalist who had just come back from Kabul, and I wanted some of the top Pentagon brass to hear what his impression was. And what he was reporting at that time was that the Taliban had taken over 5 border crossings out of the country, and that they had been making a lot of gains up in the north of the country, which struck us as slightly unusual because the Taliban's traditional base was down in Kandahar. And it didn't make sense that suddenly they were taking all these areas up in the north. They had taken these border crossings, which we soon pieced together meant that they could have customs revenue. They were moving very methodically, and the military was somewhat baffled as to what these movements meant. And we were having the conversations about, how quickly would Kabul fall? Little did we know that just a month later, on August 15th, that Kabul would fall very quickly, and that 11 days after the U.S. military had announced it had pulled out, that the Afghan army, which they had invested so much money and resources and training for the last 2 decades, would fall apart. And so when I was speaking to General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, after August 30th, when we were finally out of Afghanistan, I asked him what happened. Why did they not know that the Afghan military was going to fall apart so quickly? And he said something that really struck me. He said, what people don't realize is that when we started negotiating with the Taliban and when we were told that we were preparing to leave, we were also ordered to pull our advisors and our brigade level, battalion level advisors back from the Afghan military, back to the bases, and we were already starting that retreat a year and a half ago. The retreat did not start in July or in June. And so it had been going on for 18 months. And during that 18 months, the Taliban had read the tea leaves. They realized we were leaving. And the U.S. military was, in essence, blind. They didn't have their advisors embedded with the Afghan units. And they didn't know that the Afghan military were cutting deals with local commanders and provincial governors all across Afghanistan. They were blind because they weren't there. Since we've left Afghanistan, you hear a lot of talk from the Pentagon about over-the-horizon capabilities and how we don't have any troops on the ground anymore, we don't have any bases, but we're going to still monitor the terrorist groups that we know to still be in Afghanistan from over the horizon. Well, the Pentagon likes to also, if you see them in the hallways, they call it over-the-rainbow monitoring. And they realize that, for the last 20 years, we have specialized in drone warfare. It has been one of the signature post 9/11 tools that the military had to go after terrorists. But without boots on the ground, without eyes on the ground, we saw what happened 2 days before we pulled out of Afghanistan. That drone strike in Kabul that killed 10 people, 7 kids who were innocent. That happens when you don't have eyes and ears on the ground. You don't have boots on the ground. So in order to carry out without boots on the ground, drone warfare becomes blind warfare, and that is a problem because you can't keep an eye on these terrorist groups. And when I look back on the actual day that the U.S. finally pulled out on August 30th, I remember I was the first correspondent on the air to announce the end of the Afghan war, which was very emotional for me, given that Greg and I had spent so much time there. It was a very hard 17 days watching the chaotic withdrawal, the human suffering that we knew that was going to ensue. And I walked out of the Pentagon that night, and I had a conversation on the steps of the river entrance with a senior member of the 82nd Airborne who was heading down to Fort Bragg. And I said to him, I hugged him, and I said, it's awfully sad, after 20 years of war, to have the Taliban back in power. And he just looked at me and he says, it probably isn't over, we'll be back. And the feeling is that many predict that by being blind in Afghanistan and knowing that there are still terror groups there, and the prediction now from the top levels of the Pentagon is that al-Qaeda could regroup in 6 months. So the Afghan war, in fact, may not be over, and yet now we are once again blind in that region.
So it's very easy for us to sit up here as journalists and in hindsight say, oh, there was a blind spot, you sure got that one wrong. How do you see that coming in the future? How do you sense that something is developing towards a crisis that perhaps could be averted with a limited amount of diplomatic or financial or military action rather than it becoming a big crisis that drags the U.S. into a long, drawn-out war. Well, there's no hard and fast rule, there's no magic formula, but there was sort of a simple rule of thumb test that we developed, and that is there a functioning U.S. embassy in this country? The U.S., with its global reach, is essentially everywhere. But at some point it struck us that when we were going places to cover wars, we were going places where the U.S. Embassy had perhaps shut down a few years earlier. We saw that in Somalia in '92, in Afghanistan in the '90s, in Iraq in the '90s. Places today, whether it's Libya or Yemen, places where the embassy has closed down, it's almost a marker that, this country is not functioning normally, it's headed for disaster, and we've seen in many cases U.S. troops will follow. And I'm not suggesting in any sense cause and effect here, because the U.S. embassy shuts down. Every country, every circumstance is different. But there are correlations, and it does, we feel, very important to pay attention to this. And it also leads us to the notion that the U.S. should, whenever possible, try to keep engaging with a country, even if there's a difficult relationship. And sort of the template here is obviously the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Despite this very difficult relationship, there were always channels open, there are always ways to communicate, there were ways to deal with a crisis. And most famously, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, setting up a hotline so the countries would always have a way to talk quickly. You want a U.S. not only a U.S. ambassador who can talk with top officials in a country, but also those other diplomats who are able to have contacts on so many different levels, and not just the government level. It usually means that journalists are going to that country. It means that U.S. business people are probably active in that country. Aid groups are there. All these cultural exchanges. And just having an embassy is not just the ambassador, again, going to cocktail parties. It tends to be the place where the military attaché is working from, or the CIA or the NSA, to keep an eye on the country. So all of these things become very, very important. And when the embassy shuts down, it often means that the CIA's ability or NSA's ability to monitor decreases greatly, that journalists are probably fewer and far between in countries like this. And so it sort of led us to the notion of that the U.S. is a country that can make mistakes and has a buffer, because we have great resources and we can recover. These wars or bad foreign policy moves have not crippled the country. But it does seem to talk, the U.S. still has global interests, so it does seem to speak to sort of a need for what we call like a Goldilocks approach. Not an all or nothing, not too hot, not too cold approach. When the U.S. tries to send in 100,000 troops, it tries to remake a broken country, that's almost always too ambitious, and it doesn't ever go as well as expected. Now, it's tempting, you have such a powerful force as the U.S. military, to want to use them and try to fix a problem, to try to eliminate a leader or take out a leader and think this could very quickly turn this country around. But as we've seen in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, just removing the leadership doesn't fix the country. And then the U.S. will tend to set very lofty, admirable, perfectly reasonable goals, but they're not things that a foreign country can do, especially in a faraway place with a country that doesn't have a strong economy, doesn't have strong institutions. But that doesn't mean the U.S. should abandon or give up on these countries. I mean, the U.S. can still do things that no other country in the world can do. It has this global reach. It can provide diplomatic influence, economic influence, military assistance. Even if it's not fighting, it can provide the technology and other sorts of intelligence that no other country can provide. So it really is important to find that, and there's 1,000 different paths in between the all or nothing approach, trying to find the sort of Goldilocks approach. I think that what we've seen in Afghanistan is certainly going to drive the U.S. away for many, many years of a nation-building approach, of trying to remake a broken country. But it shouldn't lead to the opposite extreme, where the U.S. ignores or doesn't pay attention to countries that could eventually become very troubled spots. There are still many, many broken countries out there. The U.S. can help, but it can't save them all, and in trying to do so, it, I think, would again lead to failure.
When we arrived in Israel in 1999 from Moscow, the Oslo Peace Accords were still believed to be functioning, and we thought we were about to see peace break out in the Middle East. We were so wrong. In fact, we were so confident we decided to start a family, which was a little challenging when the Intifada broke out a year later in 2000. And once the Intifada broke out, what was so interesting is those daily suicide bombings and the military incursions, the withdrawal of the Israelis from the West Bank and Gaza. U.S. diplomats stopped going to Gaza and to the West Bank because of the danger of possible kidnapping, the danger of suicide bombings. It was really a withdrawal of sorts, and both sides retreated. A wall was built between the West Bank and Israel, and it really was very, very sad for us to see how, from the moment we arrived in '99, how it had changed by the time we left in 2007. Two of our daughters were born there, and I remember, just as a symbol of how entrenched the feeling of being in a constant state of war was, that when our second daughter was born on the eve of the Iraq invasion in 2002, we were given, when we exited the hospital, unlike getting a diaper bag and formula, we were given a gas mask tent for her crib. So that is the kind of fear and sense of constant conflict that Israelis and Palestinians deal with on a daily basis. But I have been really encouraged in the last year, and it's a story that I think got somewhat undercovered by the U.S. press at the end of the Trump administration, and that is the sea change that has occurred in Israel and in the Middle East with the signing of the Abraham Accords. So the Abraham Accords involved the signing and relationships for the first time ever between Israel, two Gulf states, UAE and Bahrain, Morocco, and also Sudan. Now, the changes in terms of what has happened in terms of the kind of business that is now starting between Israel and the Gulf states is really impressive. I was just with an Israeli entrepreneur who was, as soon as the Abraham Accords were signed, he flew a chartered flight of Israeli tech entrepreneurs to Dubai, and they immediately started signing deals. The prince there asked him to set up an island where he could train young Emiratis in how to do AI and cyber tech and cyber security. These changes are happening right before our eyes. But what also is happening from the point of view of the U.S. military, after the Abraham Accords were signed, Israel was also taken from, for years, Israel had been under U.S. European command. They had not been under U.S. Central Command, which was what the general in charge of U.S. Central Command dealt with all of the Arab countries and militaries. Now Israel is being put under Central Command, and there are relationships, military relationships between Arab countries and Israel. And we just saw last week that there, for the first time, there were naval exercises, but in the Red Sea with Israel, Bahrain, UAE, and the United States. What they're trying to build right now is a security architecture that actually could bring more stability to the Middle East, because what we have seen in the 20 years since 9/11 is the rise of Iran, another place that the U.S. does not have an embassy, has not had an embassy since 1979, does not have a good read of what's going on there, the potential for miscalculation in the Strait of Hormuz, or with regards to Israel, perhaps taking a unilateral strike against Iran, has really kept the U.S. military and others on edge for many years. But this is a very positive development, and I just think we should keep an eye on it, because it does show that building alliances, building relationships can lead to stability. At least that's the hope. And so we want to at least point to one piece of hope.
So we're talking mostly about smaller and medium-sized countries where the U.S. feels it can go in and have strong influence and perhaps make a significant change. But I think some of these principles or ideas that we've been talking about also apply to big countries, the great power competition that the U.S. seems to be re-entering with China and Russia. We were in Moscow from 1996 to 99, and at that point, it was this sort of heady time where Russia was becoming a democracy of sorts, and the U.S. wanted to create a U.S.-style free market democracy. And it was very tortured, and it was a very hit and miss. You know, Russia did hold elections, but they were pretty ragged. Wasn't so much free market economy as just crony capitalism, or a small number of oligarchs were able, through their connections, to take control of huge state enterprises and huge chunks of the economy. And ultimately, it didn't work out so well. So less than a decade after the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, by 2000, Russia had sort of returned to its sort of long-term authoritarian roots, with Vladimir Putin taking over, and Yeltsin and his time had passed and has not in any sense returned. So there's no easy answer. Again, this attempt to remake countries is a really difficult proposition. And so now that we're in this hard freeze with Russia, and there's so much friction, what does the U.S. do? We can't go there and try to remake their economy now, so do we cut them off? Is it all about sanctions and punishing Russia? There's certainly that sense. That's actually one thing that can bring many Americans together when we hear about Russia's involvement in the 2016 election, the big solar winds hack, which was an extraordinarily huge operation that hit so many companies, including the government. Russia is seen as a potential suspect behind these Havana syndrome cases, where U.S. diplomats and intelligence officers around the world have fallen ill. So there is a strong sense of that the U.S. needs to respond. It has to be tough with Russia. So how do they do this? I mean, I've been asking this question recently, and I had a couple really interesting responses. I recently spoke with Jack Matlock. He was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, or the Soviet Union, during the final 4 years of the Soviet Union, from 87 to 91. And he'd also served there in the 60s and in the 70s. So I had a very, very long history in Moscow. He was actually bemoaning the fact that as relations have soured, it's devolved into this tit-for-tat expulsion. The U.S. expels dozens of Russians who are spies or suspected of spying, and of course Russia turns around and does the same thing. And you've seen the embassy in Moscow shrink, but you've also seen the consulate in St. Petersburg be closed down and elsewhere in the country. And this was very painful for Jack Matlock, saying it took me years and years to develop that, so obviously on a personal level, but he just felt that this kind of gave the U.S. a better sense of the country by having diplomats spread out around such a large country as Russia. And he thinks that when times are difficult, that's when you need people there more than ever. You need more diplomats, more journalists, more business people in that country, not fewer. So it develops this sort of negative downward spiral as relations get worse. The countries have less and less contact, and it can spiral out of control. Now, I also met just this week with a couple colleagues of Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident who's in prison, who was poisoned last year and almost died. Two of his colleagues are in town meeting with U.S. officials, speaking to members of Congress. Now, their argument was actually very different. They said more sanctions, and in particular, target people close to Putin, the oligarchs in particular, and they're talking about like 35 people they really think the U.S. should sanction. Their argument is that Putin has this relationship with oligarchs. He lets them make lots and lots of money. They give some of that money to Putin. They support him. But if you can break that, if these oligarchs can no longer travel to their homes in London, in the south of France, and the Swiss Alps, and their life becomes difficult. They're going to get frustrated with Putin that he can no longer protect them and allow them to make money and move freely in the world, and that Putin might get frustrated with them, that they're causing him problems. Just a couple miles from here, a couple weeks ago, Oleg Deripaska, a Russian oligarch, they were raiding his house. It was not far from our house. I went down there. It was all taped off. The FBI went in there. Presumably, this is for a criminal investigation, not a political move. But the point being, will that have influence on Putin or not? I don't know. I was pressing them to say, Putin has been Putin for 20 years. Is this going to change him in some way? They acknowledged we don't know for sure, but we think this is the best approach to take. So there is going to be this argument, should the U.S. try to punish and sanction Russia, China, or should it try to engage? It's a tough call, but I think that's the kind of question we need to be thinking about. And I'll finish on China, because I think there's a similar scenario there, and China's an even bigger challenge. I think the biggest challenge for the U.S. in the 21st century. The U.S.-China relationship is the most important relationship between countries. The U.S. thought for a long time it could make China a good global citizen, and that didn't happen. But now the pendulum has swung, and there's a sense that the U.S. should be very confrontational with China. And I want to point one little thing from this meeting, the summit, the virtual summit this week between President Biden and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, which I thought was very interesting. It was just sort of a little, they talked about a lot of big issues, but one small thing that did seem to come out of that is they're going to allow journalists to go back to each other's countries. The Chinese kicked out reporters from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post a year ago, right around the time COVID was starting. And so, okay, that's a little thing. We're interested because we're journalists. NPR has always had 2 correspondents in China. We only have 1 now, the others trying to get in. But one thing that China, I was told this by a friend, an American journalist who is a China expert and had spent a lot of time there. One thing that was very highly prized among the Chinese Communist Party leadership was every day somebody would collect what the Western press was writing about China. And they would give this to the leadership. And this was very valuable information or intelligence for the Chinese leadership, because this is the kind of thing that was not being written about in their own country, in their own press. This was a way to see how the Western media was perceiving them, how in turn, how Western leaders might be thinking about their country. So this is very, very valuable. Well, there's no longer New York Times reporters, Washington Post reporters, Wall Street Journal reporters in China. So they weren't getting this intelligence, this information. And this is how, when we talk about the blind spots, it cuts both ways. This is a way that the Chinese leadership is probably less informed about how the West is perceiving their country right now. And when I think about China, I try to come to grips with this big, complicated place, I sort of think of the 3 C's. Cooperation, competition, and conflict. And the U.S. is going to have to be able to manage all 3 of those things. Cooperation. The U.S.-China trade relationship is still one of the largest in the world, despite all of the trade sanctions and the trade frictions. It's still one of the largest in the world. The U.S. and China just reached an agreement at the climate conference. As 2 of the biggest emitters, the U.S. and China have to work together to make any progress on climate change. So there's going to have to be cooperation at that level. There's going to be competition. A lot of it around technology. We were just at a conference that a lot of the people in the intelligence community hold, both current and former intelligence officials. Boy, the pivot to China has already occurred. Bill Burns, the CIA leader, is creating this China Mission Center at the CIA so that they can focus more on China. People that are focused on technology talk about this increasingly intense race for the artificial intelligence and the quantum computing that will be so critical, both in just the commercial sphere, but also in the intelligence sphere. That competition is often happening in ways that's not above the surface. We see some of it above the surface, but not all of it. And the third C is conflict, and how to manage or prevent conflict at times of tension. A place like Taiwan is a zero-sum game. We see the tension now. That tension is going to continue. And I'm not the most qualified person to speak on that, so I will turn that over to the military expert.
Well, one of the things our military and our government often doesn't do very well is to focus on two conflicts at once. So while the U.S. military was focusing on pulling out of Afghanistan, on July 27th, the Pentagon was caught by surprise, and China managed to launch, for the first time, a hypersonic weapon that traveled around the globe 5 times the speed of sound and landed 24 miles from its target. What makes this such a game changer and why it got the attention of the Pentagon was that it basically makes obsolete our entire multi-billion-dollar missile defense system, which had been set up to protect the homeland from ballistic missiles. In essence, the U.S. has just become blind to any sort of Chinese potential first strike capability, and this is a real, as you've heard General Milley and others say, this is a Sputnik moment, and how we respond is going to be very telling. But what concerns me is that this could set off a very expensive arms race, and that right now the U.S. is relatively blind in China, as Greg mentioned, during the pandemic. Not only did they kick out journalists, they also slowly over the last few years have rolled up a lot of the U.S. spies. And so one of the reasons we didn't see the pandemic coming is we didn't have those sensors, those people on the ground who could tell us that this pandemic was real before it got to our shores. So what worries me about China is a conversation I had at the Army Chief's house a few weeks back, in which the Secretary of the Army was saying that she thought that there was not enough talk in terms of the pivot to Asia, as there's such a race to get out of the Middle East, to wash our hands of the Middle East, that there's not enough talk about the Army's role in the pivot to Asia. And I thought, oh my gosh, they have forgotten the Princess Bride rule. And in the immortal words of Wallace Shawn, you fell victim to one of the classic blunders: never get involved in a land war in Asia. And so thinking of the Army, thinking it has a role in Asia, really sort of sent chills down my spine. The 20-year lesson of us having military involvement in the Middle East and not being able to fix some of the problems there. We then heard reports that U.S. special operators were on the ground in Taiwan, advising the Taiwanese military, potentially destabilizing that area. These are right now, we have worried for so long about the Strait of Hormuz and being a flashpoint for a potential war with Iran. Now we have to worry about the Strait of Taiwan. And what do these two places have in common? Neither Taiwan nor Iran have a U.S. embassy. We are blind. And what we have found in our long career of covering these places is that blind spots often lead to hot spots. So with that, thank you very much, and we'd love to take questions.
Question for you. You're over here.
Yes, hello.
Over here.
Oh, over here. Hello.
Tim DeRoche from World Oregon, Portland. I hear you talk a lot about the sort of way up here, a very strategic vision of your role as journalists. I think the thing that we all are challenged with is over the last few years, we have seen, in essence, a truth and information deficit. So in terms of the blind spot and the role of journalism in a democracy, how do we, maybe it's not even the blind spots, it's all of the see no, hear no, speak no's. How do we reinstill trust in the institutions of journalism and trust, because you're talking a lot about speaking with government, with people who are in power. How do we turn that around and get people to really re-engage on why it matters and why we should be looking a little bit more broadly outward?
Let me just take that for a second. I think one of the reasons that we are so concerned, Greg and I spent most of our career as foreign correspondents. How many foreign correspondents are there anymore? One of the things that's happened since 9/11, and it started a little bit before 9/11, is the bottom of the news industry fell out because the advertising model for newspapers shifted with the internet age. Newspapers became less profitable. What was the first thing to close? They closed foreign bureaus. Now, what is the first thing they close? They're actually closing newspapers. So there are local communities. The AP used to cover every state house in the country. I think we're down to just, there are huge gaps in terms of local news coverage. I'm involved with a group called Report for America that's trying to save local news, because without eyes and ears, whether it's journalists overseas or journalists in state capitals or talking to people on the ground in undercover areas, we don't have an informed population, we don't have an engaged population, and the debate then leads to distrust, misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. And we, as longtime journalists for two very different news organizations, are very concerned. And I think that that is a real theme, and the lack of journalism, both locally and abroad, is a real blind spot that's hurting our democracy.
Thank you.
John Gilbert from Hilton Head. I've got two questions, one about China, one about Russia. You mentioned the hypersonic program that China is working on. China is also in the process of building several hundred silos for long-range missiles. Who do you think they're trying to threaten or intimidate? The U.S., Russia, or somebody else? And now about Russia. This week, Russia successfully tested an anti-satellite system. They destroyed a satellite in orbit, and the debris cloud actually intersects the orbit of the International Space Station. What's Putin up to, and what does it mean for us?
So I'll just start, and when you mention China and the missile fields, the ICBM silo fields that we've now seen from satellite imagery, there are about 300 silos. I've talked to some experts who say that what's unusual about those silos, and we don't know for certain that they're for ICBMs, but they certainly look that way from the air. What's unusual is that they're very evenly spaced. When we had, during the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union, we spaced those silos in a way that you couldn't strike back and take them out. So there's something in terms of messaging that I believe is taking place in terms of how regular they know from the air that we're going to be able to see that. You also saw that there was a recent satellite image of an aircraft carrier in the middle of China that was so perfectly visible from the satellite that you had to wonder, first of all, you wouldn't need such a figure to test your anti-aircraft missile systems, but it was such a perfect vision, and they know that we're watching from satellites, that I believe that there is also a degree of, they know that this is going to set off a degree of hysteria in the US. They know that it will then lead to higher defense budgets and spending and an arms race. And I do want to make sure that we don't overreact to some of these issues. So the signaling, you're not going to use a ICBM to take out Taiwan if you want to, take the microchips that are in Taiwan. So I think we have to be very careful, not overreact, but also certainly pay attention. China is certainly modernizing very quickly. In terms of Russia, I'll let Greg take that.
I'll take the Russia part of that question. There's a certain element of recklessness in Russian behavior that we've seen for such a long time. It's really hard to explain, but it recurs so often. It's either intentional or they just do it because it's so much part of their national character or their leadership. But shooting down this satellite and spraying out all this space debris that could have hit the International Space Station seemed very, very reckless. But that is just the way Russia has operated for a very long time. Right now, Russia has somewhere in the order of 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine. Now, are they plotting another incursion, or is Putin just trying to get attention and say, hey, I want to talk to Biden, I have some demands I want to discuss, and this is his way of getting attention, that he has no real plan to send additional troops into Ukraine, a place that's become pretty much a quagmire, an expensive quagmire for Russia, although he still wants to control it. So yeah, these are the tough questions. If you're in the Pentagon, you've got to take those 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border seriously. But maybe it's purely a diplomatic ploy by Putin. Maybe it's just trying to win some concessions on something else to get the U.S. to be a little less prominent in Eastern Europe. If the U.S. is doing something in the Baltics or in Eastern Europe or NATO's eastward expansion. But you've seen Putin act. You've seen him invade Ukraine. You've seen him invade Georgia. You've seen him mess with U.S. elections. You've seen him, at minimum, tolerate lots of ransomware attacks from Russia on the U.S., which doesn't gain him anything. He's not getting reaping any big financial reward, but it's almost just a way to poke the U.S. And again, shooting down this satellite almost seems to fall in that category. We'll shoot down this satellite, give the U.S. a scare, just to let them know we're still capable. That's been a Russian policy for a long time, and it's hard to tell when they're going to follow through with it and when it just seems to be theater.
If I could just follow up on that, I would say that what I've noticed is there's a lot of attention getting that takes place. When we focus too much on Beijing, then Putin's going to do something because he's going to say, don't forget about us. I'm very worried. We haven't heard from North Korea in a while, and it's coming up on an American holiday, and they often test missiles or test us during those periods. So we have to do better, and we really need a much larger State Department effort so that we can be messaging and make sure that these countries know that we have not forgotten about them. I mean, the amount of time it takes to get ambassadors passed through Congress, and the fact that is now that each administration has a difficult time, often for a year, these ambassadorships are left empty. We do not look serious overseas when we don't have a professional diplomatic corps who is on the job day one with a coordinated message from Washington to these different countries. It's way too chaotic the way we are running our diplomacy these days, and that's why the U.S. military keeps having to get involved in places. If we had strong diplomacy, I believe we could prevent a lot of these military engagements.
Yeah, I wanted to first of all thank you immensely for bringing up the issue of our need to support local media as well as the international media. I'm now the opinion page editor for the major newspaper in Pennsylvania, in this capital of Pennsylvania, so I know how important local subscription, you have to subscribe to the newspaper, right? And when you're not informed, it affects democracy. But also, during the time you were talking about, I was the Middle East editor for National Public Radio. And we didn't have those blind spots, but we didn't have the money to cover the blind spots, right? So, the amount of money that can go into journalism as an anchor of democracy is super important. But the other question I wanted you to simply address is, yes, you gave us good news about the new accords, but frequently those accords are with leaders who are propping their own governments up, and it has nothing to do with the people. Nor do they, look at Egypt. Cold peace has been going on for a long time. So do you have hope that these accords will actually translate to friendship among the peoples?
Well, so we actually wrote a book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and our conclusion was that it wasn't very hopeful.
But that was before the Abraham Accord.
So no, it really is painful when we were in Jerusalem in 99, 2000, it felt like it was really headed the way of South Africa. We felt that, in fact, dating back to the 1940s, you could almost see these conflicts evolve in tandem, going through periods of rebel groups are formed, violence takes place. They after the end of the Cold War, 90, 91, they start having peace talks. South Africa gets to an agreement in 94, has an election. and then goes on from there. The Israelis and Palestinians were on the same track. We felt that we were going to witness a second historic moment of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement that was just inevitable. The people, because it was among the people, every day 150,000 Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza would drive into Israel to work, shop, go to a hospital, go to a doctor, and then go home in the evening. No different than being in Maryland or Virginia and coming into work and going. So a political agreement almost seemed to be catching up with what was going on among the people on the ground. The people wanted that. Palestinians got better paying jobs in Israel. The Israelis needed the labor. There was no violence, serious violence at that point. But then it fell apart, and now 20 years later, we're nowhere near.
Well, but let me answer your question about the Abraham Accords, because I think what is different this time, one, the Abraham Accords failed to deal with the Palestinian issue. So on that side, it is not going to lead to the overall peace that you would like to see happen in the Middle East. But what it does do is it leapfrogs over to the Gulf. And what was striking to me was that some of the commercial relationships right away were designed actually not just at a senior level and an exchange of aid from the U.S. to some of these governments for making peace with Israel, but actually having the largest venture capitalist in Israel fly a charter full of tech entrepreneurs from what's known as Startup Nation to Dubai and be embraced by the government as well, with an idea of setting up a university to teach cybersecurity to young Arabs who would be out of work. And let's not forget the demographics of the Middle East. A third of all people in the Middle East are under the age of 30. So if they're not employed and if they don't find work, then they're going to turn perhaps to radicalism. So I think what's interesting is not only the military security architecture that the Abraham Accords could build to hopefully lead to some more stability in the Middle East, but also this explosion of technology sharing and how every country wants to get in on that because they know that's the way to employ the population that's going to be disgruntled and unemployed if they don't.